Alright, so this is the Islamic world, part 3. This is part 3 of a 3-part series. And in this lecture, we're going to look at Africa and Islam. Before we look at Islam in Africa, we should look at some common elements in African civilizations. Now keep in mind that Africa is a very, very big continent, and there's a lot of variety. Perhaps Africa is has the most variety of lifestyles and cultures and beliefs of any of the major continents in the world. So it's very hard to make generalizations about Africa. But at the same time, we can make some limited generalizations, and then we can look at how Islam changed the way in which those parts of Africa worked. So the first is stateless societies, right? Most African societies were organized by kinship. Now, again, that's who's related to who, or clan, these large extended families. Most of Africa had no organized political power. Most parts of Africa, throughout the early medieval period, were very similar to traditional hunter-gatherer civilizations. And so these stateless societies lacked the organization and large-scale power to resist outside forces like the Arabs or later the Europeans. An important factor that helped establish some common elements in African civilizations were the Bantu Migrations. And the Bantu were a culture group and an ethnicity from the corner of Western Africa, as you can see in this map here, and they migrated and spread out all the way throughout Africa south of the Sahara. And so their language and culture helped, to kind of create some kind of commonalities throughout southern Africa. Now the Bantu were animist and polytheistic, as were most African cultures. So they had lots of local religions. Remember that animism believes that everything has a spirit. Everything that's living has a spirit. And this is, again, one of those common elements throughout African culture. Again, economic and political and land ownership was all organized by clan and kin groups, not by large political organizations like kings or churches or things like that. Africa also tended to be much more matriarchal, perhaps more than any other culture or civilization region on Earth. Africa was much more matriarchal, meaning that women controlled many or indeed most aspects of politics, family, and economics. But when the Arabs began to expand and Islam began to spread out, this changed Africa, particularly Africa north of the Sahara Desert. And the Abbasids especially kind of linked all of North Africa under the single conquest, and they kind of unified an area that was otherwise very multicultural and highly mixed. And as we're going to see throughout this project, Africa remained highly multicultural and very diverse, but this notion of the Ummah and of Islam unifying everyone kind of provided some kind of central organization. Arabic also became a very common language throughout Africa because the Muslims believe that the Quran can only be in Arabic. Any translation of the Quran is not the true Quran. And so Muslims all learned Arabic to be able to read the Quran in its true form. This is very similar to the role of Latin in Christianity during the medieval period. And so from North Africa, the Muslims actually expanded northwards into Iberia across the Straits of Gibraltar. Now, that doesn't mean that Africa, became entirely Muslim. Remember, there is a very deep tradition of Christianity in East Africa, particularly in Ethiopia and Nubia, which are among the oldest Christian communities in the world. Ethiopia was Christian before Rome was. And these Christian communities are rooted in the Greek, Coptic, and Nestorian Christian traditions, which are branches of Christianity that remain very small. And they existed before Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, two varieties of Christianity that we'll look at in this project. And so, there is a deep Christian tradition in East Africa. And this kind of set up some tensions in East Africa, right? Because as the Muslims moved in and attempted to convert traditional Christian kingdoms, there was a lot of tensions there. And this is still a part of the politics of East Africa today. In modern nations like Sudan and Ethiopia and Kenya, you have these religious struggles between Christianity and Islam, which are also sometimes political struggles. Also an interesting feature, I don't know, maybe it's just me, I think it's interesting, but for those of you who like reggae music, the Royal House of Ethiopia, all the way up until the middle 1900s, traced its lineage back to the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And so we see this, this Rastafarian image that you see down below here of the so-called Lion of Judah. That is the emblem of the Royal House of Ethiopia. Another place that Islam expanded in Africa was into the so-called Sudanic states, especially the empires of Ghana and Mali in West Africa. Now this was important because what was at stake here was the control of the trans-Saharan trade routes, especially gold and salt. And, so Islam kind of spread among these trade networks across the Sahara. The camel herding nomads of the Sahara, the so-called Berbers, had a great knowledge of the environment there, and they were able to cross the Sahara. And so they linked, what was already Muslim North Africa with sub-Saharan Africa in the west. And these two major empires that sat at that crossroads, which were these empires of Ghana and Mali, connected North Africa to West Africa, very similar to the way that Mesopotamia and Persia connected Rome and China during the classical period. And so Islam spread along these trade networks and was highly varied throughout this region. We're going to read some accounts by a man named Ibn Battuta, who was a Muslim traveler and who traveled among these empires. And he was kind of surprised how different the Islam was in these areas. He talks about the fact that everybody knows Arabic and knows their prayers and knows their Quran, but their behavior and their culture is very different. But so, as we're going to see from one of the document-based questions that we're going to do, these trade networks helped introduce Islam into West Africa and helped unite West Africa under, a certain common culture. An important figure in the conversion of particularly the Empire of Mali was a figure named Sundiata. And Sundiata was a semi-legendary Malinke king who united these parts of West Africa and set the stage for the Empire of Mali. He also was there during the conversion of West Africa to Islam. And so we see that in the Epic of Sundiata, which is a very famous epic from this time period. As I mentioned before, we're also going to read some of the accounts of Ibn Battuta, who was a Muslim historian, perhaps one of the most well-known historians in world history because of his descriptions of his travels throughout the world at this time. But while he wasn't responsible for the conversion of this area, he shows us how that conversion took place. Perhaps the most important city in the conversion of West Africa and in the empires of this region was Timbuktu, which is an important city in the Empire of Mali. And Timbuktu is a very interesting place. It's another one of these crossroad cultures, and you know that I like to talk about these in this course. Timbuktu, again, sitting on the border between more Arabic Muslim North Africa and more Black African Muslim West Africa. It was kind of this cultural crossroads, and was a very important center of learning and trade. We're going to read about Timbuktu and how advanced it was in its scholarship and learning. It was also a very wealthy place because it sat on the Niger River, and irrigation in this desert climate led to very, very high crop surpluses. And again, this was also the city through which a lot of the gold and salt trade would go. Timbuktu sat at the place where the desert met the rivers. And so Timbuktu is really one of the most fascinating cities in the medieval period. Again, because of this multicultural crossroads position that it was in. So as I mentioned a moment ago, right, Islam had some very strong effects on Africa, particularly West Africa. It helps centralize the culture. Sharia, which is the legal system of Islam, provided more central legal structures. Again, everybody's speaking Arabic and reading Arabic so they can read the Quran. There's now a single monotheistic religion that pulls everyone together. There are also some big changes in gender roles. Right, West Africa became much more patriarchal. And also the connection to the long-range slave networks of sub-Saharan Africa meant that more non-believers would be converted to Islam. And finally, all of this connects Islam to the world economy. So it's not an exaggeration to say that Islam was highly beneficial to West Africa and made it a very wealthy and organized place. Now, shifting our attention back to East Africa and the so-called Swahili city-states, remember that Swahili is a mixture of Arabic and Bantu. We looked at the Bantu migrations earlier in this lecture. Swahili is one of these mixture languages, kind of like English. If you're in my English class, you know about the history of the English language and how it's a mixture language. The Swahili city-states were also a cultural mix of these Muslim Arabic cultures and these Bantu African cultures. And so this really benefited the economy and the politics of this area. East Africa historically is one of the richest trading regions in the world, with African traders coming out to the coast and Arabic and Indian traders going up and down the coasts with the monsoon winds. And so this helped connect Africa to the larger Indian Ocean basin, really as far away as Southeast Asia, places like Indonesia and Malaysia. During this time period, the Indian Ocean and the lands around it were probably the richest part of the world. That area kind of includes China. I'm cheating a little bit by making this argument because China is much more of a Pacific region, but all the cultures and peoples around the Indian Ocean, whether it's East Africa or Arabia or Persia or India or Southeast Asia, this was the richest part of the world at this time and the most connected. Again, connections, spreading out of ideas and cultures historically has made people much more richer and more powerful. And so that's it. This concludes our third of 3 lectures on Islam in the medieval period. Thanks for watching. Good luck.